So the theme of this seminar has been liberty, of course, and we've all been hearing about different ideas of the history, the present moment, and now the future of liberty. And of course, no one is fighting for liberty or freedom more than the Ukrainians in this particular moment. It is the greatest fight for liberty that we have seen in a very long time in the West. And it's not just about Ukraine. It's about the future of European liberty and freedom, and it's really about the future of all of our freedom across the world, because have no doubt that what's happening in Ukraine is not just being watched by fellow democracies and like-minded nations, it's also being watched by the authoritarian nations, and I think we all know who we're talking about here, to understand the depth and the breadth of democratic and Western response to this kind of brutal infraction of human rights and human liberty in Ukraine. So what happens in Ukraine today, literally today on the battlefield, will define the future, not just of Ukrainians and the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian country, but for all of us. And I think we have to keep this in mind right now as attention spans, unfortunately, begin to linger, as Yulia said, towards energy prices and other things that concern voters across all of our countries. But I'm going to make the case here, for those of you that still need to be convinced, for why the chorus of voices that we've been hearing over the last several weeks, let's call them the party of peace for the purposes of our conversation, those advocating for some sort of negotiated settlement, why this is the wrong approach. And again, I think Yulia's comments on the Russian strategy of so-called negotiations and diplomacy is the perfect example as to why this is the wrong approach. But I'm going to focus on the political side of this. The basic argument from the party of peace is that Ukraine should give up some territory for peace, that this is going to lead to long-term stability and security in Europe. My point to you is that this is a complete illusion and a deeply, deeply misguided approach that won't actually lead to long-term peace in Ukraine, Europe, in the transatlantic space, and the world, but will actually leave us in a much more vulnerable, unstable, and insecure place. Why? And 3 points that I'll just outline here. Point number one is that this is a huge moral hazard. Because if we look at what the Russians have been doing in Ukraine, the massive rapes, the deportation of children, the mass brutality of torture against tens of thousands of civilians, this is not just some passion of war that we're seeing here. This is a national strategy. And this national strategy will continue in whatever territories the Russians are allowed to occupy going forward. So what does that mean for us as we're potentially trying to encourage Ukraine to enter some sort of negotiations? Well, it means we have to accept those consequences of massive human rights violations, of millions potentially of people going through filtration camps and all the other atrocities I mentioned. This isn't going to change when Russia occupies the territories it is currently fighting for in Ukraine. This kind of moral and ethical dilemma is exactly the one that we face today. So how can we be democracies advocating for human rights in so much of our diplomatic efforts and elsewhere, while accepting the eventual reality of what some sort of negotiated settlement would lead to? The second point I'd make here is that these kinds of assumptions and calls for negotiated settlement usually derive from some historical analogies. And I think in Europe, that historical analogy often goes back to the division of Germany during the Cold War, perhaps to the Korean armistice at the end of the Korean War. Both of these are wrong historical analogies. And here's the caveat that I'm not a historian. I'm always the outlier in some of these seminars that we have as a sociologist. But I think it's quite obvious. You don't have to be a historian to see why this is the wrong, false analogy. So if we go back to what happened during the Cold War with the division of Germany and the Soviet policy towards the DDR, East Germany at the time, well, the Soviets invested in rebuilding East Germany. They wanted East Germany to be the beacon of the communist state success, of state socialism, of ideology. In fact, living standards were much higher in East Germany, where, of course, Mr. Putin spent some of his formative years, and than they were in the rest of the Soviet and Eastern Bloc states. In the very interesting biography of Mr. Putin by Stephen Lee Myers, he notes how when his wife at the time came to join him in his post at the KGB in the DDR, she was really touched because when she came home and he wasn't there, he left her a bowl of bananas. And those of us who come from the Soviet Union remember that bananas were a huge delicacy that you could never get, but this was something you could get in the DDR. And that tells you everything you need to know about how much the Soviet Union invested in rebuilding that country. And on top of that, the Soviet Union did eventually recognize the legitimacy of West Germany. There was no attempt to forcefully Russify the East. There was no attempt to destroy German identity and German nationality. That is, of course, not what we're seeing today. What we're seeing today is a complete destruction of the Ukrainian territories, a leveling through artillery fire, and a certainly lack of desire and a lack of resources to rebuild and invest in making whatever part of Ukraine Russia might occupy, a success. None of that will happen. So what are we left with? What will we be left with? Well, some will say, well, at least we'll have a frozen conflict. Now, that's not a bad outcome. We have so many frozen conflicts across the former Soviet states. Look at Moldova, look at Azerbaijan, Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh. Now look at Ukraine and Crimea. Crimea seemed like not such a bad idea, relatively stable. I think for a long time, I've been trying to advocate for destroying our use of the term frozen conflict. And I think the example we see today in Ukraine makes that really something we should all be thinking about. Because why? There's no such thing as a frozen conflict. If we look at where the war was launched, it was launched from the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, so-called frozen conflicts. Crimea and the occupation of Crimea has allowed the Russian side to launch this massive blockade. It has allowed them to de facto have a military base and project power across the Black Sea. These are not frozen conflicts. These are launching pads for future aggression. So what will we see in Ukraine if Russia occupies a greater swath of Ukraine? Well, we're going to see a no man's land, a leveled, completely destroyed area of not just human rights violations and other atrocities, but a huge zone of insecurity and instability from which the Russians will launch further subversion against whatever government remains in the rest of Ukraine, both economic, political, as well as by military, kinetic force, cyber attacks, everything they've been doing so far. The Russian side hasn't changed. And I think sometimes we don't listen when people tell us who they are. And we really need to listen to what Mr. Putin is telling us right now and what the rest of the Russian officials and state-funded media, so-called media, are telling us right now. So just to start to wrap up here, there is no end game in Ukraine yet. And Yulia was exactly right. The moment has not come. And I find that in Washington, the conversations we're having now, what is the end game? How do we get to the end game? What is the end game? There isn't one, not yet. We're very much now in the fog of war. And just as we underestimated Ukrainian capabilities and courage and commitment, and President Zelensky as well, we also overestimated Russian capabilities. And of course, both sides have now adapted. And what we're seeing today is that the Russians have learned that when their atrocities are exposed to the world, which they of course were in Bucha and other places, that's when you get more momentum for sanctions. That's when you get actual political unity. They've learned that. So now we're not seeing all the social media. We're not seeing all the open source information about what's happening in the Donbass, in Severodonetsk, in Zaporizhia, in Kherson, and elsewhere, because they have tightened that control on information. So it's our job to understand that the war is in its early days, that we are in a different stage. We're in the fog of war, where we don't know exactly what's happening on the ground. It's not the first stages of war. And this could go on, unfortunately, for a very, very long time. And instead of worrying about humiliating Mr. Putin or Russia, instead of worrying about provoking Russia because we're sending them missile launch systems that can launch missiles up to 100 meters versus 30 or 50 or 70 meters, instead of worrying about those kinds of details and very much in public, we should be focusing on how do we shift the balance of power so the Ukrainians can eventually negotiate from a position of strength. And to be sure, wars do end in some sort of negotiated agreement. But often that follows a capitulation, not negotiations before defeat. And it's very clear, knowing what we know about the Russian mindset, as Yulia also described it, and what Russians seem to believe about the war, as far as we know. It's that the only way things will change in Russian society, and it will be Russians will have to change their own society, not us, is if they suffer a military defeat that leads to some sort of rethinking in their collective memory about this broader narrative of victimhood that has been so prominent in Mr. Putin's government and in Russian society, and this broader narrative of imperialism. So to go back very quickly and to wrap up here to my earlier point about listening when people tell us who they are. Well, just, I think it was yesterday, Mr. Putin told us who he is yet again on a televised interview where he compared himself to Peter the Great and made the assertion that it is Russia's right to take back what rightfully belongs to Russia. So what does that tell us about Russian ambitions and objectives? Well, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, both imperialistic entities, spanned not just to Ukraine, not just to the Baltic states, Moldova, etc. The Russian Empire and the Soviet Union covered a much larger swath of land. And if you were a country that belonged to either of those, the configurations are slightly different, you should see Mr. Putin's comments as a real threat, because it tells us something about the level of Russian ambition. It also tells us that the idea of appeasement is an illusion. There's no appeasing Mr. Putin, because as long as his ambitions remain that high, we're all at a security risk. So I think I will stop there. Thank you.
So the moment hasn't come. What will decide when the moment has come?
Well, I think I completely agree with Yulia. When Ukraine has a decisive win and a set of strategic counteroffensives and can negotiate from a position of strength. Until then, there is no point in negotiation.
A few speakers have talked about August, 3-4 months. What is your timescale?
I would not venture to guess the timescale, because so much depends on what we do now in terms of the weapons the Ukrainians receive. I mean, I'm just repeating what Yulia said, because I agree with her. Because we have a role to play as Western societies in the trajectory of the battlefield today.
But your assumption is that the balance is swinging to the favor of the Ukraine, is it?
I think right now it's really difficult to say. I think this is why this phase of the war is so critical. Because let's remember that the Ukrainians did fight back Russia's initial strategic offensive in the military space. And the Russians thought they were going to have a 3-day special operation and take over Kiev, and that was going to be it. But that's not what's happened.